Welcome to the Trampled Underfoot Podcast show. These are your hosts, Lindsay and Eloy Escagedo, coming to you live from across the country. Well, in reality, from the East Coast and the West Coast, um, Oregon and Florida. And we'd like to welcome you this evening.
Welcome aboard, y'all. Strap in, kiddies. It may be a bumpy ride. We'll see. No, nothing like that. So what's shaking? I know you've had a busy week.
Oh, you had to ask, and I
Mm-hmm.
cannot tell a lie. It's like that grocery lady that refuses to let you go when you say, "Oh, good afternoon. How are you? How are you?" And then she, and then she goes off.
There are no short stories.
No, everything's good. Everything's good.
Sweet. Okay. Okay. Well, this is kind of a weird one. We like to touch on history, and I was introduced to a YouTube channel this week that's been around for a while. It happens all the time. It popped up into my suggesteds over on the sidebar, and the channel is called Machine Thinking. I don't know if you're familiar with it at all,
I'm
but
not.
it's got 270,000 subscribers as of today.
Okay.
So, and it's been around for a while. And the video that was suggested to me was actually published in 2018. So it's been around a while. But the premise of this video was the 1751 excuse me, the 1751 machine that made everything. And basically, in this video, he starts off talking about how we were more or less an agrarian society for about 5 or 6 thousand years. And then suddenly, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, worldwide per capita income just did a massive, almost vertical increase. And it can all be traced down to a couple of root industries that saw a massive technological shift that just made everything else explode. And one of those guys, one of those people responsible for it, was a Frenchman by the name of Jacques de Vaucanson, or as we pronounce it we've anglicized it to Vaucanson. And he created the first metal lathe. He was involved in the weaving in the textile industry. And there was a certain style of silk that required the fabric after it was woven, it required it to be pressed through hard rollers. And that crushing of the silk created these kind of these spectacular patterns in the fabric itself. And wooden rollers just weren't doing the job. And they tried metal rollers, but the technology, as far as lathes were concerned, it was so sketchy. They were basically trying to adapt wood lathes, which with handheld tools and things of that nature. Well, his invention was the first metal lathe in 1751. It was still hand cranked. It wouldn't put on a motor or anything like that, but it was on prismatic ways so that you could adjust the length of cut. It had a tool cutter that was on a dovetail slide and a gear system that would allow that to move with precision. And it was all done to make big copper press rollers that would squish this silk, just flatten it and create these patterns and turn almost a waste product into one of the more premium fabrics of the day. He then went on to perfect automation of the loom until Joseph Jacquard got a hold of it, and he finished perfecting the loom and took all the credit. But back to Wilkinson, when he made that lathe, he started out just wanting to create those big copper rollers to crush that silk. But he ended up creating a tool that could create screws. It could create pistons. Later on, people took his design and modified a lathe that was used to bore cannons. They bored cylinders, which led to the development of the steam engine, which led to the Industrial Revolution. So basically, the supposition of this video is that without that lathe, none of that would have happened when it happened. It may have happened down the road, but it wouldn't have happened then. And I found that to be a fascinating topic when you stop and think about it, the lathe being called the machine that made everything. That you could pinpoint it down that narrowly to that one machine. You know,
Very interesting.
What's your opinion on that? I mean,
I started thinking about as you were going about a video that I saw from kind of like I guess you'd call him like one of these many archaeology channels on YouTube, but this guy's based out of, I believe, or somewhere near India.
Okay.
I think that's the case. And so they had lathes that were made out of like stone, and then like huge, I guess you'd call obelisk type or pillar type things, that, and he demonstrates how they would have run, and they were just huge monstrous things in the ground in the middle of a village or whatever. And so I started thinking in those terms, like that they had lathes going. I mean, I know that that's not a metal lathe, but
right.
But the idea of turning something and cutting it and whatnot, and it reminded me of that because it's so ancient and stuff.
Yes, it is. And lathes have been, they know that they were used in ancient Egypt. There are depictions in hieroglyphics of lathes in use. They were vertical, and you had one person, they had a twine of whatever material wrapped around the item, and one person was there spinning it back and forth, while another person was down lower with the tool carving as it spun. And then you had the spring pole lathes, and you had water wheel powered lathes and what have you, but they were generally speaking made of wood and used hand tools. It wasn't until the metal lathe came along that any level of precision was actually added to it. The way he put it was, whenever you can add up another position to the right of the decimal, you add precision, you add value, and you add revenue, because now things can become standardized, and now parts interchangeability can occur. Whereas before, you could do your best with a hand tool on a tool rest to try to get a certain thread count per inch or per millimeter. But it was all done by hand, so it was a little bit of guesswork involved. But by being able to chuck everything in and set up the right gearing and crank one crank to move the tool and another crank to spin the material, you could repeat that thread as many times as you needed to. And, another way he put it, and when you think about it, it's the truth. I never thought about it. Everything we have, everything we own is made by machines. Those machines were made by machine tools. And this was one of the first. And it's like, you know what? That makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
And it was just fascinating to me that came along in 1751. I mean, this channel is fascinating, and I'll put a link to this particular video, the 1751 machine that made everything. I'll put a link to this video over on the Trampled Underfoot Podcast Facebook page so you can check it out yourself. It's more about the lathe than it is about the textile industry, but because of the person who made it, there is some talk of the textile industry. But this is all based in this museum in Paris that has a bunch of his tools in it. And it's the English translation is the Museum of Industry and Arts and Crafts. Now, in arts and crafts, they're not talking about popsicle stick houses with popsicle sticks and Elmer's glue. They're talking about industrial arts, chemistry, and metallurgy and various other disciplines within that, printing and what have you. It's a fascinating subject, and I subscribed to it today, and I'm heading down that rabbit hole now. I'm here to tell you, it's really an excellent channel. If you like the history of how things were made, how things progressed over the years, and the true pioneers of the Industrial Revolution, it's really something.
Nice. So, I think I have something roughly, I guess, in construction, or a little bit old, or not a little bit. In this case, a little bit much older. So I've been looking at channels always, but I ran into this one channel, and they're archaeologists and professors that study Rome and study Roman Iberian remains and whatever is left as far as infrastructure and roads and so on. And it's interesting because the Romans built aqueducts across Europe, and I had never looked into it specifically. I mean, just what you might see here and there, but this guy goes into serious detail. They've basically found, running for miles and miles and miles, pipes made out of what do you call that material that's toxic, that's malleable but toxic?
Lead.
Miles and miles of lead tubing, and in some cases wood. It depends. But miles and miles of the stuff, and then they would compact it in this sort of, I don't want to call it mulch, but they'd compact it for miles, and then you have those the aqueducts, because they need to elevate. So there's an actual, in this one video, they show this stretch of area between mountains and whatnot where the water needed to travel from one area to the next, but it stretched miles. And what they would do is that they would allow the source of the water to enter the aqueduct, and it would be traveling downhill at whatever, angle.
Slope, yeah.
Due to the speed and whatnot, it would accumulate some pressure in that stretch. And depending on your landscape in front of you that it need to overcome, sometimes it was higher, just simply because it was higher. And so what they would do is that they'd angle up, and the pressure would shoot up without any machinery, would shoot up, and when it got to the pinnacle, to the next stretch of aqueduct, the pressure was gone, and it would start to roll down and begin pressurizing again. By the time it got to the next area, depending on how high and low between mountains and whatnot. And he was explaining that this feature of using these systems are very complex, especially when we're talking about thousands of years ago. But they weren't. He went into detail about the Romans, a Spanish professor, archaeologist, and he said they weren't. A lot of people consider them yes, advanced, but at the same time, like dirty, like the latrines that they would have in public, and the sponge. He even mentioned the sponge, like they use just one sponge, and everybody. And he says, "Would you use just one sponge? Would you think that that's after rubbing it right up the crack? Everybody using the sponge? No, 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 no." So he goes explaining as to a lot of things and how water ran and whatnot, um, and so he shifts the angle of our perception. It's all in Spanish though, but he shifts the angle of perception, and gives credit to these people, which were. And in one of the things one of the videos, he mentions that it's something that is an obvious thing, but until you listen to the whole explanation, you don't sort of like mold it into your thinking quite as nicely. Is that there were cities that were huge, huge, and we're talking about in this case in the Iberian Peninsula, huge in this case, and we're talking like BC. So
Right.
we're even talking about before the Romans, and he explains that these cities lived in what they call castros. Like you've heard of the name Fidel Castro. Well, Castro is basically a walled fortification, a
Okay.
Castro. Um, People lived in walled fortifications way
Right.
back then, and then they had their huts and their houses and whatnot and this and that. And he says, but in villages or castros such as these, and he point out, you had about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people living or more, and there was no water there. And then he reveals their aqueduct system that they had, that they would trench out in order because, and so he explained that to have a population living in a walled area, it's not just good enough for you to have a population living in a walled area. You need to have food and you need to have water, and it needs to supply that population. So, in fact, his point in that video of many was that before the Romans, and we know that this did occur, the use of, I guess, diverting waters and aqueduct like systems before the Romans, although the Romans were pretty excellent, pretty
Yeah.
like meticulous, were used in order to feed populations across the world. In Europe, it seemed, with ancient populations, and I found it very interesting. Just that whole thing.
Well, that's one of the problems, and we've talked about this before. I don't remember which episode. That's one of the problems that we have now in the 21st century, and we had in the 20th century, and that is assuming that these ancient people were stupid.
Mhm.
There was no such thing as a study of fluid dynamics. But you don't have to be a master in fluid dynamics to know that, for instance, in your piping and in your aqueduct, you don't have to have a master's degree in fluid dynamics to know that it's going to build up momentum and it's going to build up pressure, and it will change from going downhill to level and uphill for a little ways, but then you've got to drop back down. And you don't have to have a master's to figure out this angle is too steep, but this angle will make it. So when it came time to design and build that, they took what previous generations had discovered, learned, and refined, and they built on those things. The Romans didn't invent long, straight roads. They refined them and built more of them. The Romans invented plumbing, but they didn't invent the aqueduct. They just refined it and built it on a scale writ large. No civilization had built such a huge aqueduct system before, but they didn't invent it. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, as you've said many a time. But for us to assume, well, they didn't know what they were doing, they were just a bunch of idiots. Look, they were running this water, just out in the open instead of running it through pipes. Yeah, hello, dummy. They invented those pipes a little bit later on. They invented plumbing, basically, but they had to get there. So they weren't stupid. They were dealing with their environment in the only way that they knew how.
They were pretty advanced, dude.
They were extremely advanced by the
They were
time it
pretty.
got to the
They were pretty.
Romans. Yes.
They were pretty learned and advanced. No,
Hmm.
even pre-Roman,
Yes.
these people were amazing people.
Well,
So the
when
roads. Another video was the roads that they talked
mhm,
about, and it's funny because he goes in and he says, when you visit in different parts of Spain, you will see signs on the road and say, cross this Roman bridge,
uh-huh,
or you're now on this Roman road.
mhm,
Um, and he says, these are medieval roads and medieval bridges. The Roman ones, and he points to the road that people say are Roman.
uh-huh,
And if you look at it, you're like, holy smokes, this is like an ancient road because it is old.
mhm.
But he says, but that's, and he walks out into a field next to it, and he says, the medieval road parallels
The
the
Roman road.
Roman road, which is actually here, and he points, and it's just grass.
Mhm.
And he says, but here, I'll show you. And then he takes the satellite picture, and you could see the
Yeah.
Roman road, but it's been covered with, you could see kind of
Yeah.
like, and the difference between the medieval road and the Roman road was that the Roman road was pristinely layered because they've
Mhm.
gone and dug, and the layering of big rocks or cobbles down into the gradient or the grade is layered, whereas medieval was sort of compacted in and like, let's get this going, or
Yes.
some shepherd road that's kind of bumpy where your goats
Mhm.
can go through and whatnot, but it's kind of dangerous because it's not perfectly level. So he explains these things, but people, the most obvious thing is, oh well, look, because you
Yeah.
can see it, and you're like, okay, that's a Roman road. And so interesting things like that, I would never have thought, like, let's say I would have gone on a tour and somebody said that's a Roman road, I would have been, yep, there you have it. But this
Mhm.
guy is saying, well, wait, no, and he explains why and stuff, and it's interesting stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah. I love that kind of thing. I really do. I mean, when you stop and think about it, when you're talking specifically about those roads and how the Roman roads are actually all overgrown and everything, when you think about, how many centuries of dirt and dust has been blown into those things and how much has grown up and then died and then more grown up and then died and everything else. Every time they find a Roman settlement, with a few exceptions, of course, but every time they find a Roman settlement or some bit of Roman archaeology, there's a reason they have to dig for it. It's not because somebody came along and buried it. It's because nature always wins, and it overgrew and it took over, whether it be through disuse or somebody thought they knew better and built a road alongside of it. Obviously, that was a good way to go. It was a good pathway. Or maybe they just didn't understand it. Maybe they didn't understand the Roman building techniques. Maybe
No,
they
in the
didn't have the
middle
skills or the knowledge.
no by the middle ages, um according to what I understand to this point, um it was long gone.
Yeah.
um in the first 100 years, probably, or 200 years,
Mhm.
even just immediately, just about, I don't know that for a fact, but it had to have been early on after Rome fell. um it basically went to heck
Right.
in a handbasket, as far
Yes.
as their sort of, and then the residuals kept kind of, but it became more of what we see with middle
Right.
age or Germanic. We start to see more of the Germanic style influence across Europe, and not so much anymore the and you see it everywhere. You see it in my particular case that I've been studying. You see it in the buildings of Spain, that they're actually, but they're Germanic in the context of really ancient Germanic, like
Mhm.
we're talking,
Yeah.
ancient stuff. But it is a theme of that, so you can see the shift away from a
Right.
more
But we do the same thing.
Roman.
We do the
You can
same
see the
thing here.
you can see the shift from the more classically Roman,
Mhm.
where they were kind of a little bit anal about, all this, and then you see, not to take away from like the I guess the Goths that came in, because they did beautiful work, um um but there is a decrease in sort of like pristineness in
Yes.
in their in their work,
That's what
and
I
that,
mean.
that
It was speed. over and form over, or excuse me, function over form. It was speed. We got to get this through now.
And who knows the money? Who knows
don't-
how much in finance? Because Rome had the ability to throw.
Right. And Rome had the ability to branch out and move out and conquer and what have you. With the fall of the Roman Empire, these people in these other areas that were no longer a part of the Roman Empire, they didn't build the roads. They didn't know how they were made. All they know is we've got a problem over here. Let's build something right next to it. So, but we do the same thing. We think that we're improving things. If you look at the interstate highway system, let's take Route 66 as an example. There are stretches of highway that, quote unquote, follow the same route, but you're driving on an interstate freeway, look off to the side of the road, and there's Route 66 over there winding up through the hills. They knew that that was a good direction to go and a good pathway to take. So they built that interstate highway along the route, but they didn't build it on the same route. They didn't rip up big old long sections of Route 66 overall. They did in some places and build new highway right over the top of it. They paralleled it so they could keep more straight lines and fewer turns. Mm-hmm. So we do the same thing. The difference is sometimes we abandon it, but we're less likely to abandon it because one of the things about Route 66 was people live there. People live along those highways. So they couldn't close it and let it go back to nature. Now they did in some areas where nobody lived.
Oh, another thing they talk about, dude, that this was pretty cool. I didn't know this. Mm-hmm. So he explains that. So he shows a stretch somewhere in Spain of Roman road. And it's basically overgrown at this point. But there's nothing, or I'm sorry, it's basically, you can't distinguish it other than it is a path. Mm-hmm. And it was very wide. And that's another thing. Rome did the paths wide so that a chariot or two chariots could pass with no problem. Yeah. Well, so he's on the thing and he says, but here's an interesting thing. And he says, on either side, the Romans would dig huge ditches all along the road. And he explains that water runoff would, and by the way, the roads actually had
they had a crown, yes,
so that the water would run off. So that's all genius stuff. But the ditches, although it did help with the rolling off of water, when a road ran through unknown or empty areas, which oftentimes they did, these ditches prevented immediate surprise attacks from people coming out, where horses couldn't just go ahead and, mm-hmm. Trek right across. So I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah. And then I started figuring what ways could a thief or bandits overcome that. And you can actually go down in the ditch and wait for them and this and that. But mm-hmm. the point is that they created at least this buffer when you're traveling through an area that's isolated and whatnot.
Yeah, they created obstacles. There may be one or two people be able to hide in a ditch, but you're not going to hide 40 people and their horses in a ditch. So bandits sweeping out from around a thicket of trees and onto the highway to stop the shipment coming through to steal it. That was something that they were actually on guard for. So, yeah, I mean, all those obstacles, putting the water up so high, there were several reasons for it. And one of them was to get it away from people and critters, along the way. They didn't want anybody messing with it. That's water for the city. That's water for Rome. And, of course, and its other cities within the empire. But basically, they put them up so high, like right through town, to keep people out of it until they come along with the lead pipes and what have you, and they could bury those underground.
So the technology thing, obviously, you were talking about the lathe, and we went into this thing, but in today's world, so before, I guess we could think of examples of things that were toss-aways, but today we have more toss-away stuff, or just finite use items, plastic stuff, probably at such a greater scale. Anything from plates to cups to whatever. We're more of a disposable
Yes, we are.
situation.
And we're seeing the error of our ways as far as that's concerned. I mean, there are several projects right now that are focused on cleaning the plastic out of the oceans. And a few of them are showing some very, very good promise. But it's going to take, this is something right now that is so big that it's going to take a partnership between private industry, charitable foundations, and governments funding some of this stuff. But it all comes back to us and realizing, I mean, it's back to I'm going to get crude here for a second, but it's back to what you learned when you were 3 years old. Don't pee in the pool. Just because you threw something in the garbage can doesn't mean that it's disappeared to nothing. It's going to go somewhere. So be careful where you put that thing. Everything has to end up somewhere.
Yeah.
And it drives my wife nuts. We go out to the lake to go fishing. I am that guy. I pick stuff up. I mean, I find there's a piece of fishing line and I'll wrap it up, tie it in a little thing, and I'll put it in my back pocket, soda cans or soda cups or what have you, water bottles, lots of water bottles. Folks, I'm going to go on a rant here about bottled water. Bottled water companies don't make water. They make plastic. It's the same stuff coming out of your tap. That I'll get off my soapbox. They don't make water. They make plastic.
So if you're at a lake and you see a plastic wrapper sitting next to a gold nugget, you'll go ahead and take the gold nugget, toss it in because it's natural, and you'll take the wrapper with you.
I'll pick them both up. I'm serious. I mean, Linda, she just stands there and laughs at me because I'll come home and it's like I'm going through an inspection in the barracks when I was in the Army. I mean, I'm standing next to the trash can, pulling junk out of my pockets and just throwing it away. But, I just don't like to go to my favorite fishing lake and seeing the place look like trash, And I am that guy. It's selfish on my part. I know, because I don't want to see that. I want to go there and fish and have fun. I don't want to pick up trash. And no, I don't go out there with garbage bags or do that kind of thing. But if I'm standing there next to a soda can, I'm not just going to leave it. You know? So.
What if you find Pampers? Dirty Pampers?
Everybody's got to have a line. If there's a a receptacle close by, of course, and I'm not going to put that in my pocket.
What if you find a toilet piping to the brim?
Dude, you would not believe some of the stuff that I have found.
Like a clock just standing, like a grandfather clock just sitting there.
Nothing that big. Usually stuff like that is gone, but God, it's just, there's so much stuff I can't even think of. I can't even.
Just random little whatnots.
Yeah, just goofy stuff. And it's like, what was this doing out here? A telephone one time. This is long before when I was married to my first wife. A telephone. And I don't mean a cell phone. I mean a home telephone. The whole thing just laying out on the beach, not on the beach, on the shore.
What if you're walking that shoreline,
mm-hmm.
and you come across an underbrush area and you see like just something that catches your eye, and you go and you see what you find is, and you and Linda are there, and what you find is there's like a skeleton, right, sitting there in the underbrush with golden rings and chains and all diamond out and like sparkling, just sitting there, and just nobody's found. You're the first one to find this. What do you do?
I immediately take the Fifth Amendment. No, actually, I call the police. Actually, I call the cops if you find a skeleton. And, that brings about an interesting point. One of our friends, when we lived down in Nevada.
Time out before you go. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But would you think about, would you as a human being, did it quickly cross your mind other options?
No, it didn't. And I'll tell you why.
Other options didn't cross your mind?
No, and I'll tell you why it didn't. Because if it's something that is recent, that belongs to somebody. If it was something, pre-Columbian, let's say, there's a finder's fee. I'm not a greedy person.
What if your finder's fee is a week's free meal at Arby's? Thank you for coming.
And thank you very much for that free meal at Arby's. My needs are very slight.
You wouldn't take it to a higher court. Hey guys, I found this damn thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure I would do that, but I mean,
it's been now quantified that the gold and diamonds discovered by Mark Lindsay are a total $8 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's now 10%. Going.
I'll take 10%. Thank you very much.
And it's now going to, I don't know. I was going to say a politician's name. Glee Club fund.
Well, we're going to have a fight with the Glee Club. I'll take 10%. Thank you very much, because you wouldn't have got squat if I hadn't reported it. We had a friend down in Nevada who was an archaeologist, but he worked as a consultant with various industries. If you're building a building and you have to excavate down, they would do the archaeological survey and check records and this, that, and the other, and see, was there anything there that they need to do a dig for? And they moved from Nevada to Wyoming, and they were doing some archaeological surveys for a pipeline, and they found human remains.
Okay.
So immediately, the first thing they had to do was call the police, because they could tell by looking at it, this is old, but they couldn't say how old. They immediately called the police. The police came in, processed the scene, what have you, said, no, this is not, anything modern. They started working the site together. And it turns out what it was the remains of a Native American. And, they had to process an entire area around it. And they found that what it was not a settlement, but it was an area that migrating people or traveling people would stop at and camp, and might camp for 2-3 days, 4 days, something like that. And it was a known spot for that. And somebody had died there, and that was their skeleton. But they said it was a couple 100 years old. But they found human remains, and of course the guys there on the site, they were freaking out. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. He's like, calm down. This is what you went to school for, remember? Call the police, call the university, make sure you stay right there. And everybody processed the scene together.
That's a find, man. That's a find. I mean, that's what they're doing now with all these bones that they're collecting for the ancient DNA studies. And they're going to places all across the world. In one case, and I don't remember the details of the actual case, but they found an American remains, meaning someone of the Americas, pre-Columbian Americas. And they had taken it and began doing their study, but the natives, Indians, found out that it was taken from this particular site, and they quickly went to court, and there was court battles with it. And at the end of the day, they had to return the remains, but not
Right.
before these scientists were able to extract the DNA and so on. Because what it is that they draw powder from
Mhm.
either the inner ear bones of the ear or some other place where, and they can even long after there's DNA still there. And so they took it from this American, and this was pre-Columbian, pre natives at the time of
Mhm.
pre-Columbian. This was like early native peoples that
Mhm.
came into this hemisphere.
Yeah.
So nothing. It was
Yeah.
interesting. So they have published that
Mhm.
particular sample um, on online, and
Mhm.
a lot of people, including myself, it's funny enough, share a smidgen of, because you can't, from that era back to now,
Mhm.
you may have traces of, and so a lot of people actually of European extraction and native, and so that's how
Mhm.
they've been able to, one way that they've been able to bridge the gap between native
Mhm.
and European people from the distant past.
Right.
That there are common ancestry genes that were traded off, that broke off at one
Mhm.
point. Very interesting. But the natives got the remains back, and it
Yeah.
was done not before these people did what they did and were able
Mhm.
to
Yes, there
do it.
were, and that was the same way with our friend. They had to contact the university, and the university had to contact several tribal councils in the area. Now, the disposition of the remains, I don't know where they went. I don't know where they ended up. But I do know that the entire area was processed, and that's why they do this. They moved the route of the pipeline so they wouldn't disturb that. And everybody was happy. All of the tribal councils involved, they all said, no, this is not a part of our nation. We didn't do this, we didn't do that. But just out of respect, and because that was part of the contract with running this pipeline, was they had to avoid any Native American settlements or artifact or concentrations of artifacts. So they just rerouted the pipeline a couple miles away, and off they went. But this was, oh my gosh, this was years ago. This was in the early 2000s. I want to say 2001, 2002, something like that. So maybe 2003. I don't know. But
I,
it was a big, wild thing for him.
I wanted to go back for a moment to the middle age thing and the construction thing and technology and stuff.
Sure.
That I remembered. I saw it in one video.
Uh-huh.
Um, and these are typically archaeology and investigative videos and so on and so forth. It's not just like, like let's say the flat Earth thing or the alien. It's not
Yeah.
that world. This is a more serious world. But there are people that are have suggested as an option, and I've seen a few of them, but not enough to well know either way. But where they say that in medieval times, a lot of these places, like actual buildings and whatnot, because the going consensus is, or the going conversation is, they lost the ability to do concrete that the Romans had, let's say, and that the Greeks before them and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But they go through evidence across Europe that these structures were made with concrete,
Yeah.
forts and whatnot. Like they actually still knew how to do the concrete.
Yes.
And one of the proofs that they show, from me remembering, just talking about technologies and whatnot, is that in certain castles and fortifications, you'll see, if you've ever been in a construction site when they're doing the foundations, or you'll see like the concrete on one side that clumped up outside of the project and it dried, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just like a rubbled
Yeah.
compacted part of the, you get what I'm saying, where it's just concrete that was just spilled, and it's sitting there. Well, they find this on the edges of castles
Mm-hmm.
across Europe in many cases. And now the question would be, of course, a deeper is it a repair job from modern times? So there's, but I don't know necessarily that maybe there is a possibility that they were doing some heavy duty concrete as well. I don't know, but I find it an interesting angle.
Well, they were certainly using mortar. They were using lime mortar.
Yeah,
But it also depends on where you are, because the difference between lime mortar and concrete is lime mortar will absorb, and then it'll absorb moisture and then allow it to evaporate. Lime mortar will breathe, whereas concrete won't. So, and that's why still to this day, they don't use cement or concrete for cinder block buildings or for even limestone blocks. They use a lime mortar because it's got to be able to pass that moisture in and out. It's got to be able to breathe. And cement, concrete won't do that. And you build with the most abundant product you have. And if it's stone, then that's what you build with. I mean, here in America, we have our biggest resource is lumber and timber. And so we build with wood, but over there they built with stone, and they still to this day built with stone, be it natural or man-made.
yeah,
And one of the YouTube rabbit holes that I have fallen down is European renovations. And I'm following a couple of people in France, a couple of people in Spain, and a couple of people in Italy that they are renovating. In one case, the building was built in the late 1600s. And they're going so far as to, when they take stones out, they sweep out the dirt, which was a clay mortar at the time, reconstitute it and reuse it, because you can't find it nowadays. It's still perfectly fine, but there's a process they have to go through so it can be reused, and they reuse it so that it looks original to the building when it's rebuilt. And, you know, huge oaken timbers. And I mean, it's just fascinating stuff to me as a guy who did nothing but smack 2x4s together with a hammer and eventually a nail gun, watching them build with rocks and come out, I mean, nice and even and straight and pretty. I mean, just the amount of work that goes into that is just, it's just crazy to me. But they still do it to this day, you know, because that's what they have to hand. So,
yeah.
I don't know if you remember the episode I was talking about the phantom time hypothesis, that during the Dark Ages didn't actually exist. That was
Hmm.
one theory that was put forth, that
Hmm.
400 years was just a lie.
Yeah,
But that's where that attribution came from, with that, well, you know, they didn't use concrete then. Well, no, they didn't use concrete, but they did still use mortars. They just didn't build with concrete because a lot of the raw materials just weren't available.
there was a mathematician, a Russian mathematician years ago. It was one of those things that would pop up on YouTube, and he had a book that said, "And the Middle Ages didn't happen, and the this is that," and he proves it mathematically.
Mhm.
So he uses mathematics to say no, none of this, and so it's like this whole book and whatnot. I forget the name of the thing, but it was it was a crazy thing. But um, you know, due to the fact that there's documents stretching the span, and if you
Mhm.
don't find documents in one place, it makes up for it in another part of Europe, or in various parts of Europe. There's enough documents to actually say yes, the time passed as it had. Although you could always leave it up to there's always an option, that maybe not,
Sure.
but but there
Well,
are those theories.
but yeah, there obviously there are. But I mean, you also have to remember that we switched calendars. We went from the Gregorian to the, no, excuse me. We went to the Gregorian from, God, I can't remember the other calendar that we
From the
used.
Julian
Julian, yes, the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. So, but that didn't come in until like the 1700s. So,
Yeah, no. I mean, but it's an interesting,
mhm,
it's an interesting look.
mhm.
Um, into a weird conspiracy slash. But he does use mathematics. This one guy,
Yeah.
I forget what his name was, in order to literally mathematically prove that the time of the Bible was right clumped up next to the Middle Ages, and boom, boom, bam, boom, boom, we're right here
Yeah.
where we're sitting. You
Yeah.
know, very, very weird stuff.
So actually, according to him, then this would be what 1801 or something like that. You know?
I don't know. I never, but I did see, because they were pitching his book,
Mhm.
is what it was. A Russian mathematician that has proved mathematically that so on and so forth, and this and that.
Well, you can prove a lot of things with math, and you can prove a lot of things with statistics. You can prove a lot of things with maps, and you can lie using each of those. So, when somebody's going to find a little rice bowl that they can make some money on and get a little bit of fame with, you bet they're going to ride that horse. Why wouldn't they? So,
I mean, there's a lot of history in the world, even though there's a lot, and then it just. But I didn't read the book, so I wouldn't know. But
yeah, me either.
It's one of those things.
Yeah, understood. I mean, I don't know. We have the luxury of being able to look back on those centuries and those peoples, those inventions and those inventors with a 20th/21st century eye and wonder, how could they not know that? How could they have missed that? And that's not to say they didn't have a theory. It's just that it turns out that theory was wrong. I mean, you want some funny reading, go back and find some of the writings of Pliny the Elder and see some of his medical cures. The cure for an earache was to take a warm piece of bread and stick it in your ear. That was the cure for an earache. Well, that sounds a little bit logical. But the cure for a stomach ache was to hold a live puppy on your stomach and absorb its warmth. And it's like, huh? How does that cure a stomach ache? It gets worse. The cure for epilepsy was to eat the ash created when you burn the heart of a black donkey. It had to be a black donkey. You burn the heart of a black donkey, you crush up the ash, and you mix it up with water, and you drink that. And that's the cure for epilepsy.
At the same time, though,
it's some hilarious stuff.
At the same time, though, if we were to take all of us alive today, and you were to remove the computers, the TVs, the cell phones, the electricity, basically all the things. Okay, better said, if you took from modern humans all the things that each individual did not invent, then a better picture would arise of exactly what the heck these people that have arrogance and think, because we do sit on the shoulders of giants because we don't have to reinvent the wheel every 10 years.
Right.
And that's an advantage. But if you were to remove all these accomplishments that we all partake in, we didn't invent them as individuals,
Nope.
But a lot of people will take the role of saying, I am so darn, of course, as a matter of fact, when they're just hitching a ride. Because if you were to remove all the things and say, okay, go, they're going to have to reinvent a whole lot of stuff, and good luck.
They say the wheel was the most important invention to mankind, but I happen to think it was the guy who added the second wheel. Because there's only so much you can do on a unicycle, circuses notwithstanding. So taming the horse was one thing. Putting the wagon behind it was quite another. And the guy who put the wagon behind the horse was probably not the guy who tamed the horse, because the guy who tamed the horse was just looking for a ride. He wasn't thinking about hauling his entire family and all their possessions. So, it does snowball. And that kind of leads back into exactly what I was talking about with that metal lathe and the 1751 machine that made everything. Is it made it possible to make the machines that made other things, because now you could spin metal and you could cut it with precision. Now you could make crankshafts and pistons and cylinders that would seal. Now you could get rid of the water wheel and boil water and create steam. All of the parts of that creation were out there in other civilizations going all the way back pre-Roman, pre-Egyptian. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans both had a little version of a steam engine that was basically a sphere with jets pointed in opposite direction that was suspended over a fire. Then you put water in that sphere, and the heat from that fire would boil the water inside, and the steam rushing out of those two nozzles would cause it to spin. They never made the connection to put a pulley and a drive belt on it to drive something else. It took people making things, developing things, and putting things together that already existed. I mean, the technology was already there to bore a hole in a bronze cannon. You know, they would cast the cannon and cast that hole, but they had to bore it out so that it was a standard size so cannonballs would fit. It took somebody developing that lathe to be able to bore that out with enough precision that a piston would move back and forth reliably and seal inside that sucker. So the technology was already there and all the components were there. It just took a special person to assemble them. And we're still doing that today. Most of the developments in technology that we've had over the last 50 years were people who took something from one idea over here and saw a way to drive it in another direction, and off it went.
Yeah.
You know, I was watching another video of talking about Microsoft, and Bill Gates basically in, I think it was 1991, predicted the smartphone, but he called it the Pocket PC. But Microsoft never pursued it. Apple did. And we ended up with the iPhone. And then everybody jumped on that bandwagon. So, you know, even having the idea sometimes doesn't work out for the best for you because you never pursued it.
A lot of the things that we do today or use today has been around since antiquity. A lot of the things that we just, I can't think of everything now, but like one example is that one place in Pompeii or Herculaneum where it's basically an outside, what we would consider today a food truck, or consider today well, it wasn't a food truck, but the point is that it was a place where people would go, like a little store, and you could order your meal out there. And they had, the seats, and they had the whole thing. And although it's something so basic, but so a lot of things haven't really changed. We may think that, oh, this is something brand new of our time, but a lot of the things that basically humans do, a lot of it can be traced back to its original source, like the shoe, the way shoes are put together. That's beyond time immortal, the way that was worked. Although throughout history, not everybody made the shoe the same way.
Right.
But the idea of the shoe, where you have something between you and the rocky ground below you, just a series of things have always been with us. So we're very modern, but at the very same time, we're very much a continuation of everything.
Well, here's a prime example of that. The electricity that you and I are using right now to communicate, the lights above me, the electricity that powers my computer, that powers the monitor, that allows all this, my camera, my microphone, to be hooked into that computer and transfer a signal to you, and you to do the same thing to me. The overwhelming majority of the electricity used relies on man's ability to boil water. and take the steam from that water to spin a turbine to generate electricity.
It's amazing.
In the case of hydroelectric, it's water going through a dam spinning a turbine on its way out. So we haven't advanced much past the water wheel and the steam engine, because we're still using them to generate the power to that runs our modern life. And you don't get much more basic than fire. So we're still basically a fire-based society, civilization.
Yeah,
You know?
I mean, if you were to take away electricity alone, that would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
That would be catastrophic. I mean,
You
we're
want
not
to talk about the
prepared.
Dark Ages.
Yeah, we're not prepared for a downgrade of technology by any stretch of the imagination. There will be casualties, we're not prepared.
No, because we think we don't have to be, but that's another story for another time.
All right, let's wrap. We're right on the mark. So are you ready to land the plane?
Sure.
So we're the Trampled Underfoot Podcast show, starring Mark Lindsay and Eloy Escagedo, and we go live every Tuesday at 9:30 Eastern, 6:30 Pacific Coast time. We do that here on YouTube at our Trampled Underfoot Podcast channel, and we also have a website called trampledunderfootpodcast.com. You can catch our past episodes there by pressing the Wayback Machine button, and you'll see them all titled, and just download them and enjoy them on your phone as you go about your day. If you want to leave any suggestions, comments, or curiosities, we have a Trampled Underfoot podcast page over on Facebook, so you could go check that out. That's also where we leave a lot of our links, videos, and such that we talk about on occasion here on the show. We are also sponsored by
Steve Nealon, the man, the myth, the legend, the sole operator of Harneal Media. Listen, man, this is just you and me talking here. We've got a couple of seconds, but I want to give you a little advice here. If you're looking to start a website, you need to improve your web presence. You need to establish a web presence. The best way to do that is with, number one, a website. Steve Nealon is your man. If you're a seasoned veteran and you know all about websites and you're just looking for a web host, Steve can handle that. He'll square you away. If you are a total newbie like me and don't know anything about websites, Steve is your man. He can square you away, get you set up with a website, a web store to allow you to sell your items. He can set you up with merch, hook you up with an on-demand print company that'll take care of all the shipping, all the inventory. You just sit back and watch the orders come in. That's Steve Nealon over at Harneal Media, HARNEAL media.com, sponsor of trampledunderfootpodcast.com.
All right. And like I said, every Tuesday, right over here at the Trampled Underfoot Podcast channel on YouTube. Have a great rest of your week. We'll catch you next time.
Peace. All right, that'll work. Shoo! I forgot to say we were going to have an after show, and I forgot to reiterate, I will be posting a link to that video, the 1751 machine that made everything, over on our Facebook page. But yeah, that was extremely cool, and it started me down that rabbit hole. He's got another video about just that museum. It's called Paris's Temple to Science. God, it's some good stuff. It's great content, man. The channel is called Machine Thinking. Great channel. All right, let's get in a few comments here. Let's see. Rick French says, it's very funny that every Tuesday when I'm watching this podcast, I also usually have Search for Oak Island on silent so I can see what's going on. Well, do me a favor, Rick. If you find anything, if they find anything, discover any treasure, let us know.
Is that a show?
Yes. Remember we were talking about the mystery of the Oak Island treasure chamber?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the search for Oak Island. That is a TV show or
Okay.
on a streaming service or on a cable network. I don't remember which. So, see, Jim Dockerell says we have invented materials that last forever and made disposable items out of them. Preach, Jim. Preach. I mean, years ago, I was very new to YouTube, and I don't know who made the video, but it was called "How to Build Something to Last 1,000 Years," and they basically kind of went down the list of all the materials that we have created and what our technology has developed and everything else, and basically the end of all this examination came back down to, if you want it to last 1,000 years, you've got to make it out of stone because nothing else will last that long.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, what else? Unless it's like some sort of like titanium or something.
well, even then metals will oxidize, you know.
So it needs to be made out of some sort of rock stone /
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Or doused in some sort of like bog where the oxidation is stalled due to it being
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. They do find logs, oak logs that have been buried in bogs for thousands and thousands of years, but so far they haven't found a whole house.
They've
But
found weaponry as well,
oh yeah,
like swords and
oh, that was another one. On this channel, Machine Thinking, one of the videos was they smelted iron from sand, from black sand. And they gave kind of a little history of smelting and where it came from. And they said that iron was first smelted by the Hittites, before the Romans, before the Greeks. But they said before that, they knew about iron and they used iron before they smelted it. But that iron came from meteorites. They found out that they could heat up that meteorite and then beat it into shapes to be used. But it was extremely rare and extremely valuable. They said, in fact, in King Tut's tomb, there was a gold dagger and an iron dagger. And they went on to say that at the time of his burial, the iron dagger was worth more than the gold dagger because it was so rare. And after testing, they determined that it was made from meteorite. And it's just simply because of the metal, the composition of the metal, they could tell that.
That's another point to make. Also, these are things that one doesn't think about, but during the Iron Age, in order to produce all the weaponry and all of this and this and that, which they did produce weaponry before, but like, let's say the Iron Age, you had to have a whole industry, production system, labor, and like it had to be a whole thing that in order to produce the weapons that the world made war with,
Yeah.
And that idea is pretty like, wow, I mean, you'd have to have people that was their lives. They were concentrated on doing that, and that's what they did. They were. It's just things to.
Well, in this video, they actually made a smelter and smelted iron out of black sand the way the Hittites did it centuries ago, way back when. And they said they are not always successful, but neither were they.
Okay.
So, sometimes you get nice iron that you can form and forge, and other times you get this brittle, chunky stuff because maybe you didn't use enough flux, or maybe your heat wasn't exactly the optimum temperature, or they said there just are a whole bunch of variables. And if one of those variables is out of whack, it was, about 250 hours is wasted. It's just gone. So, Let's see here. Rick French says they found what appears to be buried Roman-style roads connecting several key locations on Time Island, and they're trying to better understand the significance. Okay, I'm not familiar. Where is Time Island?
It's
I
next
don't
to
know.
Rosemary.
Oh, hey, and Jim Dockerel. Are you saying they were time travelers, Rick? But ooh, Jim, go to your room and stay there. Okay. Let's see.
When I was a kid listening to Simon and Garfunkel, I always thought that time was time.
Yeah.
Until one day I was like, oh, wait a second. It's an actual herb.
Yeah.
I
Well,
had that problem.
by the time I heard that song, I was old enough to understand what they meant, but I didn't know what it was. I knew it was some sort of a seasoning, but I had no clue what the heck it was.
Yeah, I didn't make the connection. I was just, man, these people are psychedelic, man. But I'd never questioned the lyrical aspect back then when I was a kid.
Now Rick French here is the sound and the lip sync way off for anyone else. Click the live button or refresh your browser. Sorry, didn't see. Greg Howard. It's Mark's new teeth. Yes, my teeth are in the future, but only by about a half a second. So if you watch really close, it looks like you're watching an old Godzilla movie.
So we're lip syncing?
So, yeah, because Rick came back and said, never mind, refreshed his screen and it's fine. Okay. Jim Dockrell says the Dark Ages weren't so dark. International trade still flourished during that time. Items from all over the Mediterranean from that time are found all over England. True. The reason they're called the Dark Ages, well, one of the reasons they're called the Dark Ages is because a lot of things, advances in technology, advances in literature and arts and things like that just kind of seem to stop for about 300, 400 years and just kind of maintain the status quo and didn't really progress much of anything.
The fall of Rome was problematic because of all the things that what happened was that now you had severed different little, I guess, principalities, and that's when Europe started to, along with other parts of the world, started to vibe for power. And that's when you get all these sort of like group formations, societies breaking out, and people's so people were looking at it. I've heard it said, so I'm not saying this myself, but people would look at where aqueducts that no longer function sat, where these great accomplishments and such, and none of that was going on. But as far as trade, there was still trade, and there was still all sorts of things going on. But there was a freeze that occurred in some key fashion in some areas that are significant enough to merit at least acknowledgement, and they've settled on calling it the Dark Ages. But I'm sure people back then weren't saying, hey, how do you feel like us living in the Dark Ages as we are? But it's
again, that's that hindsight. We have the luxury of hindsight and say, wow, they didn't progress for 300 years. But I mean, just something as simple and stupid. You brought up the subject of shoes. There was like a 300-year span in there where there was no difference between you bought a pair of shoes or boots. There was no difference between them. There wasn't a left and a right. They were both identical because it was easier to make the same thing over and over again than it was to try to pair them up and set those aside to sell them. So, it didn't matter which foot you put it on because it fit both identically. So, let's see here. Rick French says cement comes in bag, concrete comes in trucks. Okay. I had a construction management professor when I was in college who would shout that whenever someone referred to a cement truck. Okay. Yes, I said cement and concrete synonymously, but I was trying to make the distinction that lime, plaster, and cement specifically react different. So concrete being an aggregate of sand and aggregate and water, along with Portland cement. Lime mortar is not that way. It's completely different. So that was where I made that distinction between cement and lime. So,
Bring that back up for half a second, although it's still within that. I want to mention that here in Miami, as an example of naming conventions and such, everybody, not everybody, but a good amount, calls everything sheetrock.
Yeah.
There is drywall,
mm-hmm.
which is what it's the standard name, but everybody just says, yeah, I need some more sheetrock. I'm going to go get some sheetrock. And the company's not always sheetrock, but they call it just dry. It's supposed to be called drywall,
We do
but
that.
they just say sheetrock.
We do that all the time. I mean, Kleenex.
It's incredible. Kleenex, right? Kleenex
it's a brand of tissue.
And yet another one here in Miami. This one will get you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it occurs where you guys are from. I know it occurs here because I'm going to tell you, but any angle grinder, any angle grinder of any brand, you know what it's called here?
Mm-hmm.
A Makita.
Really?
Everybody calls your angle grinder a Makita. You know what? I need a new Makita. It doesn't matter whether they bought it as a Makita brand or not. It is called a Makita. That is typical here.
I've not had, the closest I've ever had to that was when I was an electrician's helper. You know, an set of electrician's pliers. Didn't matter what brand they were, everybody called them Kleins. Hand me my Kleins. And they were electrician's pliers.
It's the same scenario where the specific brand name becomes the icon for the whole of that thing. Well, the Makita thing is interesting as heck because I think that the Makitas were popular originally here. I don't know this for a fact, but it seems to be. And it was so specific to Makita in at one time that when others came out, people just called it's just Makita. They're all, so if they tell you, hand me my Makita, and you look over and there's no Makitas to be seen, they're telling you, hand me my angle grinder.
Okay, no, I've not heard that. I've not heard that. Plexiglass is another one. Plexiglass.
Sawzall's another one too.
Yes, plexiglass is a brand that's owned by Roman Hawes.
Right.
Sheet acrylic is what it is.
Right.
But I will stand fast on one thing. I refuse to budge on this. The Velcro company has a page on their website that says Velcro is not the name of our product. It is a brand name and the name of our company, which makes hook and loop fastener.
Interesting.
BS. It's Velcro. The guy that invented it called it Velcro. It's a combination of two words, velour and crochet. Velcro.
And
he called it Velcro.
That hoop and loop thing.
Hook and loop, yeah.
It's a little too much of a mouthful. It's better to say Velcro, get it over with. We're accustomed to it. Why change a good thing?
Well, they say it's because there are a lot of things in our common, normal, everyday parlance that were brand names that were trademarked, but they came into public use to mean a certain thing, like escalator. Everybody knows what an escalator is. Well, that was a brand name for a moving staircase. But they say the company allowed people to misuse the trademark name, and now every moving staircase is called an escalator. So they want to protect their trademark by saying, no, it's not called Velcro. It's called hook and loop fastener. You can't buy a piece of Velcro, but you can buy a piece of hook and loop fastener from the Velcro product line. To which I say, BS, it's Velcro. Shut up.
Well, because it's standard. If people decide in mass on a name, it's basically due to, just mass use. It trumps for good or bad, it trumps the
Yeah.
truth of the matter. Let's say the origins of the thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's common usage at the end of the day is the final arbiter of the language.
Mm-hmm.
And that bugs me on some level because I do believe that words mean things. But if society at large agrees that there is such a word as pacifically instead of specifically, then that's just the way it is.
Unfortunately, that's true. Like, there's a new word now that people have been using, and correct me if I'm wrong, you guys out there, and Mark.
Mm-hmm.
This is something to do with a generation from another.
Mm-hmm.
But there's these. I've been hearing it a lot, and it's called. Gosh, the name is cisgender.
I don't even know what that is.
I hear it a lot. Or cis male. And when I hear it, because I get the same reaction as like Keith Richards in a loincloth with Mick Jagger on his back. I get that same cringe chill up my back. But they say cisgender, and I've not looked into it either, but I've heard it, and I've made my own assumption. Here's the key. I've made my own assumptions on what it means, but I'm so like reluctant to. I guess I will eventually, but I think it means like just a standard person, like a standard uh, with no
Individual.
variation. Yeah,
Okay.
with no variation or no, like it's to
Yeah.
do with all the modern
I don't know.
gender thing and this and that.
And like I say, common usage is the final arbiter of that, but that's why I choose not to partake. Back to the technology thing. Linda says, I was just spinning some yarn on a hand spindle, 10,000-year-old technology while watching TV. Yes. Hand spindle to spin wool. It's a rod with a weight on the end of it, a flywheel. You get it to spinning and it'll keep spinning while she draws that out to spin yarn out of animal fluff fiber. And it's basically unchanged. I think it's longer than 10,000 years. Isn't it closer to 20,000? But it's how the first ropes, yarns, and twines were made. So, yeah.
That's a big one. Let me just mention that. That's a big one too. Clothing, in the context of clothing.
Yeah.
And going back in time, obviously, well, not obviously, but I would assume, without even investigating it, although I've read a little bit here and there, but I've not made it concrete, so I don't know the timeline. But you would think that first animal hides would be the suitable thing because it covers. All you got to do is skin it, dry it, or whatever you need to do, and now you have yourself something you could cover yourself with. Whereas clothing like cotton or hemp or whatever the material, you need to weave it together or whatever the case. So there's a process involved that is not automatically self-apparent. It's not self-apparent that from a cotton ball or many or from fibrous, it's not really evident immediately that, oh, wait a second, we're going to go ahead and take that. We're going to string it out. We're going to twist and it's not apparent.
Dude, you have no idea. I mean, I have learned more about this subject through my wife and the demonstrations she does and the talks that she does in the classes she has taught than I ever knew. And the chemistry involved, the technology involved, the manual labor involved, you would not believe. And the thing about it is, nobody can point to any one person and say, this person or even this civilization invented it. All they do know is the first clothing, like you said, was hides, animal hides.
I would assume.
Because, well, you're right. Because they figured out that the animals have fur. This is warm. So when we get this animal and cook them over an open fire, we're going to dress the hide. And they had to learn how to do that and make garments out of it. The first man-made fabric that they can point to was felt. And that came from following the migration trails, which they did anyway for the animals. An animal would brush up against a tree or a bush or a rock or something. There'd be some animal hair, and they'd pick it up and tuck it into their moccasin or tuck it under their arm or something like that. And the agitation and the sweat meshed all those fibers together and created felt. And they figured out how to do that on their own. It takes three things to make felt. It takes an animal fiber, it takes moisture, and it takes agitation. So if you lay it all out, you get it wet, and you start rubbing it, you will end up with felt.
Hey, Tom, why aren't you? We're trekking across this region. Why aren't you carrying felt under your armpits? I put it somewhere else because I got tired of holding. Oh, dude, those garments must have been. Could you imagine? Hey, hey, Brenda. Yeah, are you wearing Tim's?
Dude, hygiene wasn't a thing.
Hey, Sally over there. Yeah, I mean,
hygiene was if you fell in the lake, you know. But yeah, I mean, but that's where this all came from. I mean, you know, tucking some animal fiber into your shirt because it was insulation, it'd keep you warm. And then next thing you know, you had felt, and it was warm. And we still make it today.
So the armpit thing is a given, is a truism.
Yes. Well, I mean, you know, inside, I mean, not necessarily 100% your armpit didn't have to be there. It just had to be somewhere on your body where your sweat and agitation as you moved caused those fibers to lock together.
Could you imagine the other tribe crossed the way? Here comes the stinkers again.
They all stunk, dude.
Get your axes ready. Get your axes ready because they're coming across the way and we've got problems.
They all stunk.
Man,
let's see here. We got
it's just the picture. You know, it's well. I'm not gonna go because if I had to, well, it's just boy.
Okay, here they go. Linda addresses that. She says they first used it in their footwear. They stuffed their moccasins with mammoth wool to keep their feet warm.
Okay.
And it felt it inside the moccasin, and thus the Dr. Scholl's insole was born. Sounds like a great Monty Python skit. It may very well be, Rick. It may very well be. Let's see. Linda says much longer than 1,000 years. Well, if I said 1,000, I meant 10,000. I was wondering, I thought, didn't they find it back closer to 20,000 years ago? But yeah,
a pair of pants.
The Egyptians made looms in 4,000 year BC. Okay.
They found a pair of pants that we've talked about in either one episode or before, where they actually took it apart and they redid. Remember that whole? I forget. I know they were Scythians or Yamnayas from the Russian plains or Russian steppes. And I know that was the first. They claim it to be, or they state that it's the oldest pair of pants.
Yes. They don't know if it was the first, but they do know it's the oldest they have found so far.
Right.
But I thought I saw something, an article about the oldest weaving they found was something like 18 or 19,000 years old, and maybe I'm wrong. But I don't know. But I know is they can't say that any one civilization invented any of this, because it's been the textile industry and the making of clothes has been a part of every civilization on Earth. They've all just taken different ways and used different resources based on their needs. In the warmer climates, they didn't need as much as in the colder climates.
Yeah.
But, I
Or
mean, you don't.
how about the idea of a fireplace inside a home or a longhouse for the Vikings or whatever?
Mhm.
And I guess that's self-evident because you'll burn your roof. But the fact that they had an opening in order to allow for escape
Mhm.
of I mean, there's so many things that obviously,
Yeah.
in today's
Well,
world we would consider, well, yeah, obviously, but it's been around these things,
yes.
for a while.
Now, from everything that I have read, the interiors of these homes or huts or caves or whatever they were living in, be they permanent or temporary, were still smoky, but not as bad after they figured out proper drafting and where to put the fireplace, and what kind of fresh air coming in to send the smoke up and out they needed. But again, you don't have to have a master's degree to know that this doesn't work. We have to let some air in to drive the smoke up. Otherwise, it's just going to fill up the room and we're all going to croak.
Yeah,
So they weren't stupid. They just learned from previous people who tried something and either succeeded or failed.
yeah, generationally.
So, yeah. Uh, Greg Howard says the teepee has an opening in the center of the top that is adjustable. Exactly right. And if you look at the teepees where it meets the ground down there at the base of those poles, there's an air gap. And that's to allow ventilation, fresh air to come in and send that smoke up. So,
Yeah, that's an interesting.
nothing happens in a vacuum. Smoke is only going to rise if there's something to replace it, you know. So, let's see here. Oh, Harju is doing his Wikipedia thing, as he should. He's reading 120 to 170,000 years ago for evidence of clothes, 8,000 BC for textiles. Okay, okay. So, yeah, roughly 10,000 years old. But, rope is today still made in more or less the same way. Individual fibers, be they hemp, cotton, nylon, polyester, are spun to a certain tension, and then 3 or 4 of those are individually wound the opposite way so that the tension that's built up into them locks them together.
Mhm.
And they'll only unravel if you cut it and start unspinning it, then it'll unravel.
Right.
But, somebody figured out that if you take a bunch of hair, you can pull it apart. But if you take a bunch of hair and twist it, you can't pull it apart.
Right.
And that was the light bulb moment for the guys that were inventing the wheel at the same time. So, see, we're not just fun, we're educational. And thank you to everybody who is doing some looking up and checking into this stuff, because I know it's not something everybody's interested in, but we like to be educational.
Every now and again.
Yeah, every now and again. But I learned about, when you think about some of the chemistry involved in just dyes, that's another thing. How they could take a green plant, the root of that green plant that makes yellow flowers, and they can take that root and they can boil it for a certain amount of time and add this chemical to it, which was a natural substance that they could just had floating around, and then take that and then cool it down and mix it with this other little thing and mix it with something else, then bring it to a boil again, cool it off, and it's a purple dye. It's like, what? How did you figure that? Who was the first guy that did that?
They figured it out.
So
I could imagine a king somewhere in the ancient world saying, "Bring me 3 of my best conjurers," and they come up and say, "Your task is that I want you to replicate," and he pull out like a petal of a flower, this color. If you do not do so, off with your heads or something like that. And they go out and like bust their backs trying to figure it out so they could survive. I could see all sorts of scenarios happening.
I'm looking up something here. Um, oh, what is okay? Never mind.
The
Is a
color purple.
matter. Um, oh, come on, Charlemagne. Charlemagne had a party trick of his own. Okay,
A what?
a party trick.
Okay.
He had a tablecloth woven of asbestos. As long before they figured out that asbestos dust would give you cancer or anything else. But his party trick was, after a sumptuous meal there in the castle, what have you, he would have the servants clear away all of the dishes and all of the service, everything off of the table. He'd take that tablecloth and he'd throw it in the fire. And everybody would sit there and ooh and ah that his tablecloth would not burn. And he'd leave it in there for half hour, 45 minutes, and take some tongs and pull it out, put it back on the table. Yes, it was hot, but it had not burned. And that was his big party trick. You know, I mean, yeah, you know, small things amuse small minds, but it was wondrous and exciting to them that a king could have something that you could not burn.
Yeah. Most people would not have even, that was just wild to them.
Yeah.
It had to have been.
I mean, I'm full of little anecdotes like that. I can't remember who it was. I've read so much and seen so many goofy things, I can't keep names straight. But I can remember back in the 1400s that there was one scholar talking to another scholar, and he was just absolutely flabbergasted about this one scholar's ability to read to himself silently. And he wrote a couple of paragraphs about his ability. His eyes flew across the page, deciphering their meaning without speaking them aloud. So the meaning was known only to himself and no one could overhear. It was just amazing to him that he could read quietly, silently to himself and not have to read out loud to understand those words.
When was this?
It was in the 1400s sometime.
No, but people were doing that before that, dude.
Maybe, but it was news to this scholar. It was news to him. You know, there's so much that we take for granted that is just holy cow.
I guess that was just like his observation and whatnot.
Yeah, it was. But it was something that was wondrous and completely different to him. That how could you read you're not reading out loud? How are you able to understand that without reading out loud? Well, I'm just reading it to myself. Then he'd sit there silently reading, and it was just fantastical to this guy. He just didn't understand how a person could do that. I don't know.
But you know why that I scratched my head on that, because you had already you had just, I mean, even into further in antiquity, a bunch of scripture and writing and people, you know, and documents and such that you would assume that people not always would read out loud. So, well, you know, it's weird.
Very, very few people could read back then. That was basically left for the clergy for the most part and certain scholars. But for centuries, it was the monks and the priests and the bishops that did all the writing. And that was about it. And then suddenly people started getting trained in it and schools started to open up, things of that nature. But for centuries, reading and writing were reserved for just certain people. The common man didn't read or write. So finding somebody else who could read was kind of strange unless you were in that little group.
If you were part of the nobility or the upper class that was educated, even back then, there's evidence they weren't the farmers and peasantry and all that. But you know, and maybe not totally. I don't know that. I question that to this day. Not not that the majority couldn't read, but now I start to question what that
I'll look it up.
variation, what that percentage. I'm starting to question what that percentage was.
Mhm.
Was it greater or lesser than what
Well,
one would assume?
we can only go by written reports, and those reports were written by the people who could read and write, obviously. So if it wasn't important to them, they didn't write about it. That's why most of the earliest texts are religious texts, because those were the only people who could read or write.
And treaties, and also
And that's when,
land. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, and that's when that became important for other people to start learning how to read and write. But before that, the parish, the church owned it all, basically, or it was given verbally. It was only when, it was
This is
after
a
William the
complicated.
Conqueror.
This is a complicated subject. Trying to hone in
Yeah,
that because we're talking about. I don't know what era we're talking about, but
it was after William the Conqueror. I do know that it became important for other people to be able to read and write, and it was simply straightforward because of what you just said, provenance of land ownership. You know, that had to be proven. But a lot of kings and queens couldn't read or write. They had scribes to do that for them. It wasn't important for them to read or write.
Yeah, they had scribes that obviously you had to have people that and those would have been the scribes, and we know that the clergy and stuff, but I'm not sure anymore about the illiteracy. Not that there was none and not that there was the
Yep.
majority, but I'm starting to, or I'm not so sure about now, to stamp it, as that anymore. Although it's reasonable to think, according to what we've read in the past, that it was probably the majority for sure. I don't have a doubt with that, but I don't want to decredit the people of that time. So I'm not so sure anymore, is what I'm saying.
Well, and that's not to say they didn't create their own method of communication, written communication. Case in point, and this could be a podcast topic of its own. There is a language called Nushu, Nushu. It's a syllabic script derived from Chinese characters that was used exclusively among women in Hunan province in southern China. It's called Nushu. Men couldn't read it. Men couldn't write it. It was a secret language for women only. And when a girl got married, she would be given a book, and her mother would teach her to read and write in Nushu. And that's where they kept their diaries and all their secrets and everything else. But it was a secret language that only women could read and write in. And it was used up until, it may still be used now. Let's see. Yeah, it's still used in Hunan. Okay, the last person, I take that back. The last person proficient in this writing system died in 2004, age 98. That was the last person that was proficient in the language. So it's no longer used now. But
Well,
there are various societies that have been set up to try to preserve it.
Yeah, it's a good thing to look into, at least in my mind, for my purposes. And but I don't know, just to get a clearer picture. But I'm due to what I've read. I'm inclined to still agree 100%, of course, that the majority of the people would not have engaged in the study of language or reading and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much how did that look? I don't know how many of the population at large were able to read maybe some words,
Mhm.
Like, I don't know, you know what I'm saying? I'm not knowledgeable in that by any stretch. I would like to find out what that would have looked
I,
like.
I I think it's more than we, the average person who hasn't looked into it. I think it's more than we think it was. But I still believe it was the overwhelming majority didn't know how to read or write, mainly because a lot of it, despite the Industrial Revolution, there was still a large population that was agrarian and they just didn't care. I mean, they came up with their own methods of counting their cattle or counting their sheep or what have you, or there were regional methods
No,
like
there were
Yantan
regional
Tether.
methods.
Yeah, like
Whoever,
Yantan Tethera and what have you.
whoever, whoever
But
could. Go ahead. Go ahead.
go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, 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 no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, but it wasn't really, they could make a line and they knew, you make 4 lines, then you make a diagonal. They knew that was 5. But if you wrote out the word FIVE, they had no clue what that
Yeah,
was.
so maybe they had a
Yeah.
limited
Yeah.
thing.
I
And I
mean,
was going to say that.
you have to be able to make sure that you're getting the right amount. If somebody's going to give you 25 shillings, you have to be able to make, to at least count.
I was going
to-
to say that I was going to say that I do know that they had census and reckoning for
Mhm.
how much, like if you had an owner of an area that was
Mhm.
granted ownership of a city or township, and I know this through Spain, that the king would grant said lord
Mhm.
this, and then he had people that lived there. It's kind of like the same thing throughout Europe, but they would have a tally, and then
Mhm.
you'd have people coming in, so they'd have to describe how many cattle, how many people lived in the thing, and so they did that
Mhm.
because those people had to pay money and taxes to the lord, which then turned around and paid it to the king or whoever was the larger
Mhm.
strength in that region. So they
Mhm.
did have accounting and whatnot and stuff. But my I would assume that the people that work the land and stuff would
Mhm.
not necessarily be
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
reading and whatnot. But I don't want to. I would like to know what was that, more or less, or as best as I can get. So
yeah.
that's a curious thing that I want to look into.
Yeah, I have a suspicion that it's more than we think it is because you're bringing up a lot of situations where that kind of knowledge is valuable. But then again, by the same token, I know that my 6 times great grandfather, who received a Civil War pension, his signature was an X because he couldn't read or write. And I know for the next 2 generations, they couldn't read or write either. It was like my 3 times great grandfather, so great 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 grandfather, he could read and write, but only just. And my great grandfather went to school till the 6th grade, and that was it. It just wasn't seen as important anymore. If you could read, you could write, you could count, that's good enough. Now get your butt to work back on the farm.
Well, there's also the issue. I don't know about, like, let's say England, which is usually what most people focus on, particularly, here in America and stuff. But I can say about Spain that the population, particularly so in the 1800s,
Mhm.
you would have in the little, I guess you'd call, province where my grandfather was born in the
Mhm.
early 1900s.
Mhm.
In the 1840s, there
Mhm.
was roughly 2,000 people living in that whole area.
Yeah.
And that's a place that takes up various towns.
Mhm.
So you had a limited, small group of people. 2,000 people is a lot of people. But
Right.
in the context of, it was
Not
basically,
when it's spread out. Yeah.
right. So how would, any schooling have looked like? You know what I'm saying? All these
Yeah.
things that one would. So it's something to look into on my end.
Sure.
I'd be curious to look at what that looked like, but I could imagine that population being less.
Mhm.
Um, Still, there was sufficient population to do all the things they did, but it was less than what we would have, like, let's say today. Where, so I would assume that things were more difficult even on the population level.
Sure. And we're also forgetting about the civilizations and societies that had no written language at all. Everything was passed down verbally,
Yeah, but that's
you know.
that's I'm talking about, like, like the European thing. But
Sure.
if you go in that direction, you're talking. I don't
But
even
there
know. I haven't thought about those.
there were civilizations here in North America and South America with no written language. I mean, there were some that did have a written language, but there were many, many more that didn't have a written language. Everything was passed down verbally. So
that's something. I mean, we take for granted that too.
Mm-hmm.
Language itself.
Yep. Okay, let's see here. Greg Howard wants to know, Eloy, you going to need new razor blades soon?
I don't know why.
I think he just next time will take step closer to the razor.
I don't know why. Actually, I do, but I don't know why you would say. But who's
you know who that is, don't you?
No.
Snow Crusher.
Okay, so because the Howard part really got me. That's the part I didn't know that was Greg. If I would have known that.
Yeah, Dan asked him earlier up. He said, "Let's see, let's find him here." Dan Haryu asked him. Oh, come on, where is it? Okay, here it is. Greg, you get banned from somewhere and have to change profiles?
Oh, okay.
And this is just in case.
Oh, wait a second. No, wait a second. I know what's exact. See, I can't even say it publicly. I know exactly why he's undercover.
Undercover.
I know why.
Yeah, well, but I just blew that cover.
And you just blew that cover instead of being under the radar.
Well, I'm a big mouth. I'm a blabbermouth. What can I say?
You just got this guy sent up the creek without a paddle.
Are you kidding me? Greg is so clean he squeaks.
That sounds like jailbait terminology. Or jail.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but no,
Greg jailbait as in jailbait outside of jail. I'm saying
Greg is so squeaky clean. It's not even funny, man.
Okay, so now saying it like that, it sounds like a religious thing.
Yeah,
much better.
It's the truth.
The other way, it sounded like someone in prison to say, "Hey, okay, let's stop that."
Yeah, let's stop there. In fact, I think we need to land the plane big time now. But Greg, I like your style, and I've been thinking about doing that too. Sign into my other YouTube account and just go into live streams and chat with people and see does anybody know who it is. Actually, they would know immediately who it was because the logo for that channel is the same for this one. What can I say?
There might be a meeting over at that one place where people have meetings at, for those that have meetings later, if you would like to have a meeting.
Okay.
We'll catch you guys later.
All righty. Have a good week, y'all. Thank you for visiting with us.